So my name is Micheal Ewing. I am originally from Houston, Texas. I've been in Nashville since 2009. I came as a student at Fisk University um, and graduated in 2013 with my degree in art and psychology. That's a great question. So the first question I think is the easier part to answer. Um, so I originally came to Fisk University as a dramatics and speech major, which was kind of the university's version of communications. And was really interested in kind of journalism. I think to go deeper than that, was just very curious about people, and I started to take psychology classes as a sort of an interest as my elective. And my advisor was like, "Mike, you've done so well in psychology. If you take a few more classes, you can be a double major." Well, the communications department shifted, and so I had to shift to elective studies, which essentially was more suited for me to be an art major. And I took a class called Arts and Ideas with. Before that, I took a studio painting class with the professor Alicia Henry, and in that class, I found myself not really doing my work, uh, but I found myself at the different kind of desk or the canvases of my classmates. And Alicia Henry asked me, she was like, "Mike, have you ever considered being a curator?" And I think that question within itself not only formed a seed, but I think formed a curiosity and forged a new path for my career. So the next year, I took a class called Arts and Ideas, where I was able to curate an art show for the Spring Arts Festival. And what I found was what I was able to do as a curator was take kind of my archivist mind of wanting to mine things, do deep research, but be also an ultimate storyteller because I was able to build narratives as a curator. But then I could be hyperly curious about people. So I didn't know a field that allowed me to be hyper curious about the individual creator of something, hyper curious about the zeitgeist of the moment that is being created in, and have the ability to design environments that people can explore, right? Those curiosities, those artists that are really tremendous in the work that they do. And so I think that's what brought me there, and that's what holds me, because I look at curation as a vehicle for restorative history storytelling, as a transformative justice way of like really thinking about things in a broader way. And kind of like a comedian, I think curators and more particularly artists are able to tell hard truths in beautiful ways. And so it gives me a medium also that can be right in your face, but also be subversive at times. Mm. So it's actually interesting. My senior year of college, I read the book The Alchemist, and something about that kind of the main character kind of looking for this treasure on the other side of the world. And for me, like many black artists and creatives, I was drawn to move to Europe. So I moved to Paris. And I think what Paris did for me, it's interesting when people talk about travel. Uh, Sometimes they talk about travel from this perspective of kind of what you see and what you explore. But I think what's really particular about kind of my experience, or even broader, the African American experience, when you go to places like Europe or just go to places outside of the world you live in, there's a sort of silence that you experience that you've never experienced before. There's a way that you can see your identity outside of kind of the lens of being in America that is so, I think, important to understand your life and understand your existence in a more broader space globally. And so for me moving to Paris, I thought of James Baldwin, I thought of Richard Wright, I thought of Josephine Baker, I thought of Henry O. Tanner, all of these incredible people. Um, but what I really thought about was myself and how I was participating in the world. And I think that year of introspection and being able to zoom out allow me to also approach the way I curate in a very intentional way, where I'm not just looking at exhibitions from the perspective of even just the artist or the perspective of my immediate audience. I'm trying to think about it from many different vantage points. And I think travel gave me the portal and the accessibility to tap into thinking about things beyond my lived experience and beyond my lived kind of boundary lines, you know? There's a few. I think, as you know, I just co-curated an exhibition with Fisk University called Kindred Spirits Intergenerational Forms of Expression, 1966 1999. And what was interesting about that, if I step back a bit, when I had my first assignment as a curator at the Frist, and kind of it being kind of a historical moment because I became the first African American curator at the Frist. And the museum is quite young. You know, it's coming on 25 years. When you think about that, kind of in the age of so many other museums like the Met or the MoMA, it is really very much in its infancy. But one of the first questions I thought about is, it's interesting sometimes when we talk about the first, because I think it's kind of a sort of a political tool of languaging to be like the first, because in actuality I'm not the first, right? Like I'm the first at the Frisk. But I think the curious question I wanted to ask was what other curators were working in this space, particularly in this landscape in Nashville, more directly in North Nashville. And so when you ask that question, I think of David Driscoll. And so David C. Driscoll, born in Georgia, graduate of Howard, comes to Nashville in 1966. And what he does is he brings a a level of intentionality around centering the artist, from artist residency programs to progressive exhibitions to bringing like cinematographers like Carlton Moss or photographers like Bobby Senstack. Um, and he becomes a sort of a conduit, a cultural conduit to bring some of the greatest minds to Nashville and kind of build out the landscape of art here. And so when I think about early examples in doing my research, everything I could fathom or what I would imagine a curator would do in kind of cultivating the art ecosystem was the things that he was doing. And this is in the 60s. Uh, I think kind of coming closer, Victor Simmons, who was at Fisk and ran the art gallery, similar in the same lineage of David Driscoll from around the late 90s until 2015. He was a direct mentor to me when I was at Fisk. As I talked about, once I knew I wanted to be a curator, I took an independent study with him. His son was also my classmate. And so there was this kind of accessibility to him. Actually, when I was working on a new show I'm working on, I talked to a few lineages of curators. Robert Hall, who graduated in 19, I believe, 72, and is at Fisk until around 94. Um, David Driscoll, Victor Simmons, and then most recently Jamal Sheets, right, who's there now as the curator. And so, in many ways, my career has been the byproduct of a lineage of black curators here in Nashville, but not just black curators in Nashville. I worked for 10 years inside the art gallery system. So, working with Ann Brown at the Arts Company in Nashville, which many people would know, or Tenny Contemporary, really allowed me to both understand kind of curation from an institutional level, but also from like a commercial gallery level. And so, those are kind of a few of the lineage figures that have been important to my trajectory. But I think are important if you're thinking about the landscape of particularly black curators in Nashville. I think if you go back as far as the 60s, you will see that really kind of pronounced in Nashville. Mm. So to your point, I think you for those who may not know Jefferson Street or who are thinking of like what would be a comparative, contemporary comparative, it would be like West End now. right? And so what's really interesting is that in some ways, in unique ways, right, segregation by mere kind of design made these deeply pocketed, concentrated black areas. And Jefferson was one of those spaces that was sovereign and liberated in a lot of black businesses, from the Ritz Theater to restaurants, right, to all type of services you may need, from pharmaceutical to juke joints to all of these things. You hear these amazing stories of people like Jimi Hendrix and other people coming and playing on Jefferson Street, BB King, so many people. And so I think the importance of that is, like, when you think about cultural memory, is the spatial identity of what cultural memory does. And so even though I came in 2009, you could still feel the reverberation of the cultural history that permeated and permeates on Jefferson Street. Some of those businesses still exist, even if they're not existing in the way that people may know them in their heyday. There's placards in certain areas that tells you that this space was important. Um, and so, as someone who went to Fisk University, which sits right off of Jefferson Street, there's also this kind of ritualistic idea of knowing that someone 20, 30, 40 years ago would have walked down Jefferson Street for some reason or another. And so something about that also, even with the buildings shifting, even with the buildings absent, there's something about knowing that on this piece of pavement that I walked on, um, someone that was excited about life and excited about education or living in Nashville that looked like me, uh, trekked and explored those spaces, I think keeps this kind of embedded energy into every kind of square foot of Jefferson Street. And so you have like the Sound Museum, right? You have places that are still uh, well springs of information and sacred spaces that we have to continue to protect and preserve. But I think that what Jefferson Street is what so many main artery streets to black communities are. Is it is a visual, uh, it's sort of a monument to the existence of black folks in a unified way. It's a monument to the gathering and the celebration of black commercial business and community. And so, um, even though its presence isn't as kind of as full, and as kind of voluminous as it once was, the presence of what it is and what it means, I think, is still there. Yeah, so interesting story. About 7 years ago, a good friend of mine named Carlos Partee, who's from Nashville, who has such a rich history in his family owning clubs and stores in Nashville, always want to do this history project called like talking about North Nashville, uh, and talking about Nashville, particularly black neighborhoods. And so 2022 or 23, he was kind of um, permitted a grad. And he came back to me after those 7 years. He's like, "Man, Mike, this is that project I was talking about." And what's really interesting is that one of the curators, his name is Robert Hall, still living in graduate of Fisk University, had did this Jefferson Street project that he started, and he was going and getting photos and getting archival histories and getting interviews with people. And what was really interesting to your point is that when Carlos wanted to do this exhibition, I was excited for two reasons. One, because I love libraries, I love the archive. And so it gave me a chance to deal with cultural memory, and particularly the medium of photography, versus many times I work in many mediums, but it might be painting, sculpture, whatever. But this was kind of very archive and kind of photo focused, um, as well as kind of getting this memorabilia. And so what the interesting part about that project was, is it led me to have to go into the archive, and I actually kind of in kind of this unique way was able to collaborate with Robert's Hall project that was done 20, 30 years ago, um, in a way that I kind of me and Carlos were able to kind of build upon it. And so I think those are those moments where not only going back to the curatorial lineage of like, man, this project was important in the 70s, and now, you know, shoot, almost 50 years later, this project is still important. And so I think that project ended up winning National Scene granted it as Archive Project of the Year, Critics' Choice. And the thing I think that was so fascinating was we invited certain local families in to digitally scan their images and their photos of their families, and now it's stored in special collections. And so the project wasn't just about like telling these cultural stories. It was also letting people know that you're a part of that story, right? And how can we invite you in? And so I think going back to kind of your original question around curation is that's the interesting part is I can deal with public memory, I could deal with cultural memory, but then I can also deal with contemporary ideas and ideation, and kind of archiving that as well, so that future generations can kind of look back and say it's similar to what you're doing. What are people thinking? How they're talking? I had a friend yesterday tell me uh, she just became a professor at Princeton. She was like, Mike, you're so rooted in the South, you have to write a memoir because as you're working on these projects, yes, there's these academic offerings that you're giving and these kind of curatorial things, but it would be nice to just know your raw thoughts around how the way you're thinking about the South and how you're thinking about your work changes over time. And so she's really pushing me now to write a memoir, and I'm like, man, I might convert some of my journals into that. And so I just circle back to say that's the really great thing about curation. I think it asks for the whole part of who you are as a person. So what's your sentimentality around memory? What are the ways you think about life and how do you approach things? And so all of those things come out, I think, when you curate, and all of those things can be focused uh, in your kind of professional life and through a professional lens if you're able to channel it in the right way, you know. That's a really good question. So I'm working on a show right now. I just finished the title with an artist named Fahamu Peku, and for the show, we he was like, when I work with artists, so I always ask the artist not what you're working on, but what you're looking at. So I really ask artists what are they reading, and I try to read similar texts that they're reading, so that we have a similar consciousness of like the literary kind of like anchors that we can talk about, right? Because what I found as a curator sometimes talking to artists too anecdotally uh, can be hard. They're putting so much of themselves into their work, and they're kind of they're figuring out themselves, and they're figuring out who they want to be and how they want to show themselves, how transparent or how vulnerable they want to be. And I would used to kind of go deep with artists in that way, and I found that labor sometimes had more harmful effects than empowering effects because they're trying to explain their work with the work, and then they're trying to explain the curator, who in many ways is a kind of a conductor or a translator to the audience about the work in deeper ways. And so having to like be vulnerable in both areas seemed like a lot. And so what I found is that when I started to talk to artists about the books they were reading, um, it gave us a kind of a landing space that we both could come from very different perspectives, but the text is kind of unmovable. Like it's kind of realized because this text has been printed. And so I was reading Fanon's famous text, was it Black Skin, White Mask, right? And so it's interesting because it deals a lot with identity. And so the show that we're engaging with, he has a body of work for Hamu Peku called The End of Safety. And he's really wrestling with this idea of black identity because he's talking about how so much of it is the invention of white people, right? And so much of it, from its beauty and from its demonization sometimes has been co-authored by other folks other than just the people that live within that skin. And so it's really had me think about race and identity in a very kind of different way. And so I asked myself, who am I beyond a black curator, right? Um, and the name of the show is called "This Face Behind This Mask Behind This Skin." And we wanted it to kind of feel like a mantra, like this face behind this mask behind this skin. Who am I, right? This face, even within our skin, we wear these masks. And who am I beyond that? And I think uh, to go more directly at your question, I think that I'm very conscientious of how I physically present. End of safety is kind of dealing with this veil and this idea of how I present in my black skin, and how that already has certain kind of connotations to people, and people already think they know who I am when they see me at first glance. Um, but I go a step further and say, like, who am I beyond that, right? And the other book that I'm reading, which some people may find a bit controversial, is called, I believe, A Sky Full of Elephants. And this is the author's first book. And in the opening scene of the book, all white Americans go to the nearest body of water and they commit suicide. That's how the book opens. And so folks wake up one day, white American, the author, and they go to the nearest body of water and they commit suicide. And the rest of the book is really about an American space where just black folks are kind of wrestling with their blackness and their identity. And I bring that book up because sometimes when we talk about identity, so many times we talk about it in this kind of um, dichotomy or kind of resistance against kind of white supremacy and the white gaze. And so in this particular book, that's absent now, right? After the first scene, you're really witnessing black folks have to engage with themselves. And one of the main characters is a young lady who is half white and half black. And so her white side of her family has committed, right, has walked into the water, and now she's having to reconnect with her black father. And they're dealing with race and identity in these really interesting ways. In the way the community is kind of governing themselves and dealing with things in a certain way. And so I bring that book up because it's really one of the first times that uh, and sort of what Fanon is doing in this classical text is like having you wrestle with your identity without thinking of an oppositional force against that. And so by kind of this moment of kind of internalization of identity and who you are and how you want to present yourself in a world that you don't have what you deemed as kind of these oppressors around you, really makes you think about identity in different ways. And so I say that to shorten my answer and say is, on one end, I understand, and I've understood how my black identity has informed my work. Uh, I also have understood that how my black identity has, and how black folks historically have been deeply inclusionary, deeply diverse, deeply integrated into all facets of life around the world, has been of a sort of technology. So many times when you talk to black curators, thinking about including people's voices, being intentional about creating safe spaces is something that I think there's a kind of a preset empathy built into that, because our experiences, we know what it feels like to be a marginalized person and people. And so in some ways that lends me a certain cultural sensitivity and thoughtful posture when I approach my work. On the other hand, I'm always kind of having these conversations with myself and with the artists that I work with of how do we explore ourselves beyond our identity and how we present, right? And I think that is kind of like a really beautiful space to be in, is to like recognize who you are and how you present, but also think about who you want to be and what that would look like if you could present in the way that felt most true to you. You know, it's interesting, right? It's Ralph Ellison has an opening line. He says, you know, I'm invisible not because I'm invisible, but because you choose not to see me. And so I think sometimes we don't actually talk about the power of blackness and how the invisibility allows for a quiet growth and mobilization of subversion that's needed. And so, in some ways, uh, sometimes people dismiss you because of your blackness, and by dismissing you, they don't see you as a threat. And so, there's a sort of safety that comes with that, right? So there's this weird feeling of like, going back to the title "End of Safety" of like, what does that really mean? I'm starting to learn as I get older that safety is an idea. I don't know if it's a real truth. Like, what does truly safe mean, right? But on the other hand, in some ways, right? Because I think people naturally sometimes we may think about the negatives. I think the positives have been being black and leaving America made me see that in a different way. I remember when I was in Germany. I was in Kiel, Germany, right by Strasbourg, and this little kid was just like staring at me, right? Like, but in a way, like at first, I thought this kid was staring at me in this kind of way that was confrontational or somewhat um, this kind of gaze that was like of judgment. But in many ways, I saw wonder and curiosity in his eyes. Right? I was doing this fashion shoot. I was dressed up in a certain way, and me and my friends are on the train or on the transit were in a certain way that I felt that it enamored him to kind of see things in a certain way. And so uh, I started to find that, like, yes, there's some people that see my blackness as a threat and they have these preconceived notions, but there's also a population or a community of people that are deeply curious about my story and deeply curious about my humanity and deeply open to my humanity. And again, going back to why I think international travel, a global perspective is so important, is because when you just think about blackness from the context of the American lens, it is very different. Like when I'm when I was in Paris, people didn't call me black; they called me American, right? They're like, this American guy. He's 5'11". They start to describe my features, right? And black wouldn't necessarily be the first thing, and that was really interesting to me, right? Because in America, it'd be like black American, black dude, 5'11", such and such. But in Paris, it would be like, oh, this American guy, he's from the South, and they start to describe my nationhood and regionally where I am, and then these different attributes about myself, and it was just really interesting to see how people described how you describe a person outside of their color, and it made me understand that very differently though when I lived in South Africa. When I was living in South Africa in both Cape Town and Johannesburg, knowing kind of the background of apartheid, when I was considered a colored man, there was these I had to confront these same kind of things I was confronting as a black man in the American South. Like that was really interesting when people saw my blackness, but then they were looking for my cultural ethnicity, and they were almost upset. I remember I went to the Apartheid Museum, and a man was like, he started speaking Zulu to me, and he was upset when he found out that I wasn't Zulu. He was like, no, 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 man, you're not American. You got to be Zulu. It was because he was looking at my blackness for my features, the shape of my nose, the shape of my lips, uh, the roundness of my chin, and I didn't understand that, and so South Africa made me look at blackness very differently because though it was black, there was these very distinct features that people would think you're Xhosa, people would think that you're Zulu, or people would think that I was all of these different things. And so it made me actually have to look at the beauty and distinctness of my blackness, right? In America, you're just dealing with your blackness, I think sometimes from an identity space of safety or self-value. When I went to Africa, I was thinking of my blackness from a space of the most distinct details of my blackness. Is my blackness present as West African? Is my blackness present as South African? Is my blackness present, as Nigerian? Like it made me actually want to go deeper into my ancestry because people are like, yeah, you black, but but black there has so many layers in different ways it shows up. It made me have to explore my blackness in a way that I didn't explore my blackness in Europe. I explored my blackness in Europe and seeing myself as a black person, as an American. I explored my blackness in Africa, seeing myself as trying to find these tribal connections and these kind of ethical uh, ethnic ties to spaces and cultural ties to spaces at a level I had never considered, right? And so uh, that was a very long answer to say, right? I think when we deal with blackness, it's such a nuanced concept, and it also depends on where in the world you ask that question. So I think that the legacy, I think about that a lot recently because my mentor said to me once that actually Dr. Berger came to him and said, Jamal, think of all the shows you want to curate in your life, and how long would it take? He tallies up these shows he wants to do, and it take like 50, 60 years, some crazy amount of time, right? He's like, there's no way you could do all of those shows. And I thought about that because I think that sometimes in your profession and anything that you do, if you think about what you do from a space of function, you're always going to maybe think about what's the byproduct. If I function this way, how much can I produce? What can I do? I think when you're talking about legacy, it goes beyond just like your function in the world or even just your profession in the world. But I think it speaks to um, the imprint you want to make. And for me, I think the imprint I would love to leave is one, the power of curiosity. Um, I love I love creating space where people feel okay to be curious about and question everything. I think it's actually quite healthy. Um, I was talking to a theologian not too long ago. He talked about how many times in the Bible the word seek, like seek, 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 seek. And seek in many ways is a posture of attentively wanting to understand. And so I think for my legacy, I want people to say, man, Mike was deeply curious about life and culture. And what we saw as a byproduct of his exhibitions was him bearing witness. Like my posture for how I curate or how I even navigate the world isn't this absolute truth that I'm presenting to people. Isn't this like it is like, man, here's a unique perspective that I'm approaching. And as a witness, I love the word witness because I think of court systems and think of like cross examination. So it's like I like to bear witness in my work in a way and in my legacy that I want you to examine it. I want you to question it. Like I want you to create counter narratives to what I'm creating. Like if I do an exhibition and someone says, "Man, I would have did it this way," I'm like, "Let's do it." You know what I mean? Like that. That's actually what I want to spark. I'm not trying to be so. I want to be rooted, but not statued or just. I want to be rooted, but not fixed. I'm not in a fixed position of what I feel like, right? And I think goes back to when my friend said you should write a memoir. Because I think one of the most powerful things about a memoir is to see the progression of how a person thinks and sees the world. And so, uh, I guess in truth, my legacy is to be a memoir of my curiosity. Like I would love that to be my thing. And the second part of that was what? Yeah, and I think that too is to make people see things in very different ways. I find that in my work, like for instance, I'll give you two instances that I think are like really clear examples of a unique way I approach my curation or just my thinking around things. I was doing a project in the neighborhood, a historically black neighborhood in Atlanta called Pittsburgh, and I was working with the Office of Cultural Affairs. Right, ironically, I'm working with the Office of Cultural Affairs, and at the time, I looked to like sociologists and behavioral scientists sometimes to look at the framework of their findings as a sort of tool when I kind of converged that over into the art space. And so I was looking at Pierre Bourdieu's model of cultural capital. and he breaks it down into the embodied state, which is like taste, how you see things, the objectified state, which is like this table or this chair, or the institutional state is like a bank or a school. And I said, well, what if, when we talk about doing it for the culture, what if we identify what part of the culture we're investing in helping? And so this project, we're able to have about $250,000. And so I broke it into, I thought about redlining in communities. And if you don't know about redlining, different communities would be color coded around kind of this concept and idea around investment and value. And so a red space was kind of like hazardous, not to invest in. A yellow space was kind of neutral, and a green space was kind of that. So I took that same color, and so for anything that was institutional, I made it red to think about black communities historically haven't been able to trust certain institutions. Anything that were like the objectified buildings and structures that we're doing projects at, I made those yellow because those can be neutral. Those can be safe spaces. They can be sacred spaces for communities, but they also can be fortresses to keep people out, right? Or, they could be jails. They could be, they could be police stations that are not designed in a way to be helpful to people. But then what I put as green was the embodied state, was like the people, the human capital in the community. And so I was able to use Purdue's kind of concept, Pierre Purdue's I said Pierre, yeah, Pierre's concept around cultural capital as a tool and a lens to think around how to reinvest into this community on a project. Secondly, there's one of my favorite thinkers. His name is Howard Gardner. He has a book called The Five Minds. And one of the minds he talks about is the synthesizing mind. He talks about how many times, like how you get to a certain level of like brilliance or expertness is through this kind of deep synthesis with things. And I started to think about that in the lineage of an artist. And there's an artist named Wesley Clark who I was looking at his work over a 10-year period and how it evolved and it was informed by these different things. And so it made me understand that, oh, this is a human synthesis, right? So the name of the show is called Human Synthesis. So I'm taking Howard Gardner's observation of the synthesizing mind and using the curiosity of the synthesis of this artist over a 10-year period and kind of having this exhibition that retrospectively talks about that. And so you're pairing one with the sociologist, with Pierre Bourdieu. You have another one you're pairing with this behavior scientist, with the synthesizing minds. But it's a way that's kind of giving you nuanced curiosities about the artist and the work that they're creating. And so I think that's the type of imprint and that's the type of impact I want to leave, is cross-pollinating these worlds that people seemingly don't think have any kind of congruency with them. I think if the one thing I would want to share is that I approach. It's gonna sound so crazy when I say it, but like 100 years ago, so I originally wanted to be a minister. When I was originally, before I even got to Fisk, uh, pre-Katrina, I was going to go to Xavier and I wanted to study theology. Um, and what I found was like even some of my favorite writers and favorite thinkers were very much influenced by the Black church. And what I found was that 100 years ago, the pulpit would have been a space where that deep curiosity, where like exploring these stories and these parables through the biblical lens of the Bible and these stories would have been my artistic contribution to the world. Um, but as I started to get into learning more about ministry and how I wanted to approach my life and legacy, there was kind of deep trauma around the institution of the church and even the ways in which it was inclusive or exclusive to certain peoples and communities, and even the ways and kind of sometimes the rigidness in where the interpretive space could be in this lifetime. That wasn't a container or a vehicle that I felt that I could most appropriately engage with, because now I had the access to be a curator. I had the access of the arts. I had the access of art history, and I could blend in biblical references, historical moments, sociological views, bring into kind of cognitive ideas and cognitive functions of how I'm engaging with. And so I think that, like, when I talk to people, this is just the iteration of who I am based on the times that I'm in, right? If 100 years ago I might have been uh, um, a minister, 100 years before that I might have been a playwright. You know what I mean? And so I say that to say, when I talk to people, yes, I'm a curator, but more than that, I am a what they call a griot. I'm a storyteller. I am interested in the oral traditions. I'm interested in history. I'm interested in cultural memory. I'm interested in public memory. And so, in this iteration of my life, I'm a curator. Uh, but I think there's so many other places I can be. And so, I would love to kind of evangelize to people in a way. When you think about what you do, think about how it operates in the world and not necessarily what the title is, right? And I think there'll be a liberation in what people find purpose in if they actually navigated through, like, what do I want this thing to do? What do I want to do, right? Like I said, I want to place where I'm deeply curious. I can deal with historical references. I can deal with creative interpretation, and I could create deep, intimate uh, relationships with artists in a way that I see their humanity, see their life, and maybe push and propel their stories, right? That is something that I can uniquely do as a curator. But there's probably 5 other jobs that I could do that can speak to all of that. And so, who's to say that me being a curator isn't my fixed position or my fixed title? The curator happens to be the medium in which I'm navigating in the world. And I'm navigating the world during this lifetime. 100 years from now, I may present as some totally. I would maybe present as something totally different in the function or the title of what my role may be. 200 years from now, it'll be something different. So I think it's just really interesting for people to think about their life in that way. Is to say, what are the things I want to explore and engage in more than just going back to race and identity? It's like more than these labels that kind of tell who I am. Like, what do I do? Right? What do I explore? And so I just I enjoy that about myself. I enjoy kind of probing and kind of interrogating myself about that, and I enjoy exploring that with other people. Certainly, because I know you work with Fisk and you work with students all the time, and so they're so obsessed with what their major is, and not obsessing like what classes do you want to take. So I literally started taking classes I was interested in, like psychology, and became a psychology major, but not because I wanted to be a psychology major, just because I was taking study of the mind, industrial psychology class, behavioral psychology class. These things seem interesting to me. And I'm obsessed with the learning of the thing that the actual title or even the major kind of became more pronounced later, right? And so I would tell people, and I would continue to tell myself, to deeply explore how you want to function and navigate the world more than how you want to describe that title or that label for people to note what you are in the world.